Hey out there, people. Welcome back to the Book Nook. It's time for another hot and spicy book review. Today we're reviewing The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. So I got this out of a book box about 3 years ago, and I didn't read it until this year, and I'm kind of glad I held off on it because it is a treat to read, and I did have a lot of fun, but I feel like I might not have appreciated it all those years ago, so I feel I read it at just the right point in time. The Eyes of the Dragon is one of Stephen King's only forays into fantasy. Of course, he's the king of horror, but he also writes fantasy. More recently, he had a book called Fairy Tale come out, but much like a lot of his recent stuff, it's kind of subpar. And The Eyes of the Dragon is a much more classic volume that really has a lot going for it. When it came out, a lot of fans hated it because they were used to him just for horror, and they didn't really approve of him trying something new and cool and kind of becoming more versatile with his genres. But I would say that The Eyes of the Dragon is underappreciated. It does not get enough respect as far as the Stephen King bibliography goes, because it's pretty damn good if you actually bother to give it a read. So, The Eyes of the Dragon, much like another Stephen King book I read, Insomnia, features lots of characters from the Dark Tower series, which I still haven't read. I remember in my Insomnia review, I didn't like Insomnia because by the end it just felt like all the characters were just a commercial for the Dark Tower, and it really robbed the actual impact of the book itself, and I felt like there was no reason to read the book because it was all just building up to the Dark Tower, and I was like, this book doesn't stand on its own. This book actually does stand on its own, even though it's more intrinsically tied to the Dark Tower and features more characters and settings from the Dark Tower series, which I still haven't read. I used to think I would hate the Dark Tower series, but the more I hear about it, I think I just don't want to read it because I know it'd be like the biggest commitment I ever made in reading something, because it's like 500,000 fucking words or whatever. It's like insanely long. But who knows, I might have a fun time reading it. I think I'd still prefer it. I'd still say that it is like definitely Stephen King's best thing, hands down. But I probably don't hate The Dark Tower as much as I think I do. Mainly I just hate post-apocalyptic fiction, so I also don't like The Stand so much, because I just don't think it's as scary to have just a story set in a world where everything's gone to shit, because like, part of the horror, counterintuitively, of a horror story is that there is a functional world outside. Like, scary things happening in a functional world is actually scarier than scary things happening in a world that's just fundamentally broken. Like, part of the reason The Shining is so scary is in part because the horrors that go on at the Overlook are, like, separated from the civilized world just outside it that's just like oblivious to what's going on up there. And that's one of the reasons why The Shining is so effective, because it's not post-apocalyptic, because it takes place in a world that still functions and operates and feels kind of like our own. One of Stephen King's weaker books, Cell, is literally just about like an apocalypse where everyone's cell phone just like vibrates so hard that it makes them explode. Like, what a weak fucking premise that is, and it just goes to show, like, Stephen King does not know how cell phones work, because I don't think that can happen. But anyway, as for The Eyes of the Dragon, like I said, this was a controversial book, because unlike The Dark Tower or The Stand, this is probably one of the least Stephen King-ish things that Stephen King ever wrote. He really tried to become versatile here, and I have to admire and applaud that risk that he put in. So, on the front page, it is advertised as epic fantasy, as only Stephen King could envision it. I wouldn't exactly call The Eyes of the Dragon epic fantasy. I guess it is high fantasy, technically. It's not low fantasy. Admittedly, my familiarity with fantasy and, like, high versus low and magic systems and all that is pretty scarce. I've only ever read The Lord of the Rings. That's the only fantasy book I ever read where I really went, oh my gosh, I get why people fucking love this, because this is awesome. I read the first few Chronicles of Narnia books when I was, like, really young, and I didn't really like them. Too much Christian allegory in them for me. And then I read the first couple Harry Potter, but, like, Harry Potter's the bottom of the fucking barrel as far as fantasy goes. So I don't know too much about fantasy, but I wouldn't really call this epic fantasy because it's not that epic. There isn't really anything in here that's like that awesome or incredibly mind-bogglingly like epic, like, you know, like the Battle of the Rohirrim or Pelennor Fields or anything like that. It doesn't get to Lord of the Rings levels. Editing Nick here. I realized while making this video, I looked up what epic fantasy is, and epic fantasy and high fantasy are basically synonymous. Epic fantasy doesn't necessarily mean that a fantasy has to be epic, but it's defined by its use of good versus evil. Even then, I would argue that The Eyes of the Dragon doesn't qualify as epic fantasy because a lot of the characters are gray. Like, although Prince Thomas is painted as kind of an evil person, Stephen King still tries a lot to add, like, depth and three dimensions to him, and even says very blatantly at certain points that, oh, we shouldn't feel like Thomas is just purely evil. So it's like, you're adding so much depth to these characters that it's not reductive enough to be called epic fantasy. It's too nuanced. So even then, I don't think it's epic fantasy. Anyway, back to the video. It's a very insular, kind of claustrophobic read that only focuses on, like, a very specific location. Like, there's no adventure, really. There isn't really, like, a journey or a quest or anything. And the world beyond, like, the main city is barely even gone into depth, and you just feel like, you know, I wish there were more books by Stephen King set in this little, like, fantasy universe of his, because it's pretty fucking interesting, all things considered. And much like The Wizard of Oz, I kind of like it because, you know, it's from an American perspective, which makes for a really interesting alternative to, like, purely European fantasy. This is more European than The Wizard of Oz, but obviously Delane and Roland have, like, heavy Western influences to them. And also Randall Flagg is the main antagonist of the book from The Stand and Dark Tower, the so-called Dark Man. So Randall Flagg is the main antagonist, and right off the bat, I have to say this is the best choice that this book makes to connect it to, like, Randall Flagg, because this makes me want to read Stand and Dark Tower and shit now, because he's presented as such a compelling fucking antagonist in this, such a miserable bastard. He's such a conniving fiend. Stephen King is so good at writing good fucking antagonists. Like, what's his name? The evil one from the Dark Half, or, you know, obviously Pennywise. So good at writing villains, effective villains, and Randall Flagg is such a bastard, such a piece of shit in this, that I want to read The Dark Tower now. I think I do. I think this has actually served as an effective commercial because, like I said, it's a self-contained story that doesn't mess around. It has a satisfying payoff, and it feels like there's some intent behind it. There's some actual, like, emotion, and, like, Stephen King actually had a point. Unlike with Insomnia, which just felt like a meandering mess the whole way through, like, ideas that are never fully delivered on. I feel like fans of Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast series would like this. I've never read Gormenghast, but I have seen the plot synopsis and the characters and fan art and stuff, and I feel like if you like Gormenghast, you would like this, or vice versa, because they're both pretty dark, and they take place in, like, castles and, like, just, like, towers and stuff, and so I feel like that's kind of the audience for this. I think one of the reasons maybe this got a poor reception is just because it was marketed wrong, because it's not really epic fantasy. It's more something like Gormenghast, kind of a dark gothic fantasy. Because make no mistake, even though Stephen King is trying to make it a fantasy book as opposed to a horror book, there's still a lot of creepy shit in here. Like mice that, like, burn up and turn into skeletons, and and like a fucking creepy parrot and a creepy spider and shit. And I mean, Flag's just like fucking creepy. He's just like a fucking creepy character through and through. Like, even something like the Witch King from Lord of the Rings is not as creepy as Stephen King is able to make Flag. And just being a horror author, he makes this book extremely creepy. It's a spooky read, I have to say. So don't go into this thinking it's going to be like sunshiny and rainbowy just because it calls itself fantasy. It's not really like a light, fun read. You won't come away from this feeling like you've just taken a nice little stroll through the Shire. You're gonna feel kind of icky after reading this. Speaking of icky, one of the things I don't like about Stephen King, I have to admit, is the obligatory phallic reference. Like in every single one of his books, he feels like he has to mention a penis at least once. Like you'll be reading along and it'll be like just an innocuous paragraph, and it'll be like, oh, the trouser snake, and you're like, why do you have to mention that, Stephen King? And it's not like it's relevant to the story that's going on or anything. He just like mentions penises at random points during his novels. It's fucking weird. I have no idea what's up with that. But The Eyes of the Dragon is no exception. It mentions a penis, but thankfully it's pretty early on. In fact, it's like before chapter 7, like in the first 20 pages. So he kind of gets it out of the way right up front. So everyone who is going to stop reading just because of that just drops the book. And everyone who doesn't mind it so much, like I can forgive it because it's just such a good book. You know, you can read past that and just go on. But I don't know what it is with Stephen King and penises. He feels the need to like mention them just like in every single one of his books, even where it doesn't even make any sense. Doesn't even need to be there. Like, it's fucking weird. There's also a weird amount of talk about vomit and like snot. And I think maybe Stephen King is just trying to make it a fun read, you know, if you're like 13 or whatever, very immature and juvenile, you find this funny. Partially it's because it's set in medieval times and like the stuff about like they don't have working plumbing and they vomit a lot. You know, that is historically accurate, but I also feel like it's kind of just like juvenile. And again, I'm not really sure what kind of age range would particularly enjoy this book. Like, it's kind of too namby-pamby to be enjoyed by like Stephen King's adult audience, but it's too long for like a kid to read. Like, it's over 300 pages. It's definitely in the longer range of his books. So I'm not exactly sure who the target audience is. Again, that's probably a reason why this was kind of a flop upon release, because it doesn't really have an audience. It's a very unique kind of writing. One thing you'll immediately notice when you read it is that Stephen King is writing in a really specific style. He doesn't use his typical delivery. He writes exactly like an old fairy tale. It's kind of amazing how easy he's able to pick up this style. You can tell that in preparation for The Eyes of the Dragon, he must have read a lot of like Brothers Grimm and stuff, and like that classic traditional type fairy tale. Because this is delivered in like a more traditional way than, yeah, probably even Lord of the Rings. Like, it's delivered like an epic saga, or like, you know, like Beowulf or something, in this very classic traditional type fashion. I don't really know how to describe it, but going in, you'll immediately be struck by it and you're like, wow, this is Stephen King. I mean, it's kind of obvious. You can kind of tell there are some signifiers there, but it's written way differently from all of his other books in a whole different style. And again, that's probably a reason that people didn't like it, because it's not like his other stuff, but that just makes me like it all the more, because it's a serious change of pace, and it's really interesting. One thing I will say is that it feels like he tries to draw out the story way more than it needs to be, just to hit that 375 fucking page count. It's actually like 380 or so, but at least in my edition, this is the 90s edition with the illustrations by David Palladini. These aren't the original illustrations, and I think there's 4 editions, all with different illustrations. It feels at points like he's trying to really drag out these events, Like he'll say, oh, so and so is spying on so and so or whatever, but then he'll like go into a tangent about how like the window was built or whatever, and it's like, okay, but like let's get to the thing at hand. It seems like he goes into a lot of tangents and really draws it out. Because again, this isn't just like a simple fairy tale. He's trying to make a novel here. He's trying to make an epic masterwork of fantasy. So he really like draws it out at length, describing these very simple events, like just like, you know, just like walking up a hallway or something, in like laborious amounts of detail. To anyone who says Tolkien puts too much detail into Lord of the Rings, like, the only reason there's so much detail in that is because it's about stuff that actually needs to be described in detail. But here it's like Stephen King will just be talking about someone like making a fucking sandwich, and then he'll jump back to like the day before and how the idea for the sandwich was conceived or whatever. And it's like, it's just kind of convoluted. The timeline's kind of confusing because he keeps jumping back and forth and going, but before we get to this point, we have to mention this point. And it's like, why didn't you just mention this point first and then just relay these events in chronological order? But again, he's trying to adopt the stylings and mannerisms of like an old European fairy tale. Like, he's not exactly telling this to you in an analytical or like sterile way. He's telling it to you like you're sitting in front of a fireplace right next to Stephen King, and he's just like warm and fuzzy, and you're just listening to this stuff escape his lips, and he's just like telling it to you like he's just like half remembering it or something. Like I said, it's a very weird method of delivery that he's using. I will also say that The Eyes of the Dragon, much like The Shining, like you know how Stephen King really connects with the character of Jack Torrance, and he's like, this is my most autobiographical book. And obviously Stanley Kubrick turned Jack Torrance into an irredeemable character because, of course, if you're an abusive alcoholic, that's pretty fucking irredeemable. But Stephen King sees Jack Torrance, he's like, oh, he's my boy. I made him, and he's basically me. So, in this book, you also get a lot of the alcoholism angle that Stephen King likes to cram into his books. Maybe the penis type deal is the same thing, but he talks a lot about alcoholism. And, you know, it's probably an issue. You know, he has a family, he has sons, and he has a wife and all. And that's obviously very deep and important to him. And I will say that Stephen King is able to make an issue like alcoholism much more relatable and present and, like, understood than another less subtle author might be able to. Because the way he describes, like, alcoholism in this book, the old king is like an alcoholic. It's very scary, and it's very spooky. It's very haunting when you read it, exactly like how alcohol takes a hold of him. But again, it's not a problem that I deal with in any capacity, so I just find it kind of boring, and like Stephen King is trying to shove his own life into it too much. Like, I feel like it's kind of self-centered to just make all your characters character inserts. Like Roland is just him, but you know, that's okay. If he wants to explore his struggle in a fucking fairy tale book, whatever. One thing I will say is the main dynamic where you got Randall Flagg, he's a very Grima Wormtongue type character. So if you like Grima Wormtongue, and you like the dynamic between him and Theoden in Lord of the Rings, you like the dynamic of this, like, misled king being, like, thrown off by this evil, skeezy fucking advisor type who's just, like, a fucking power grabber, you know, just a little shit, then you'll really like Flagg in this, because it's basically the same dynamic, but stretched out to, like, 300 pages. So, if you feel like Grima's kind of underdeveloped in Lord of the Rings and doesn't get enough credit and doesn't get enough clout, because he's a wonderful secondary antagonist, then in here, you know, that's the primary antagonist. That's the whole conflict of the book, basically, is just Flagg. He's just, like, such a bastard. Very different from Grima in a lot of ways, but the same type of character, but it's, like, very, very different. And again, he's like the same exact guy from The Stand in Dark Tower. He's like an immortal being, like Pennywise, so he's just able to be in a medieval setting as easily as he's able to be in Dark Tower or whatever. It's really phenomenal. He's, again, my favorite character from this, without question. He's a wonderfully, wonderfully written antagonist. Another thing that The Eyes of the Dragon really succeeds at is it doesn't remind you of any other fantasy series. It's not really like Lord of the Rings. Like I said, the most obvious comparison would probably be Gormenghast, but it's not really like that either. It's not like Narnia. It's not really like Game of Thrones. Like, one criticism that I often make of fantasy stories, and the only reason I really like Lord of the Rings, and it's like the only fantasy book I can really, really sink my teeth into, is that all too often fantasy stories will be set in like a Europeanish type setting, and they'll just stay in the most boring fucking part, you know, like Game of Thrones, for instance. There's the whole continent of Essos, but then there's like Westeros, and it just spends most of the time in fucking Westeros, which is basically just like England. And that's like if Lord of the Rings spent all the time in the Shire, you know, that's the fucking boring part. So what I give Lord of the Rings credit for mainly is that it expands beyond the Shire, and you get to see like Rivendell and Lothlorien and Rohan and Gondor and all these interesting places. It takes you on a sweeping world tour, you know, this grand adventure, instead of just like staying in fucking Castle Keep and all this shit. That's one of the reasons I think Game of Thrones is so fucking boring and never really got my attention. But what The Eyes of the Dragon manages to do, weirdly enough, is it actually manages to be pretty fucking interesting, and it always feels fresh. Like, even though it takes place in the same spot and doesn't move around that much, like I said, it's very much not epic fantasy. That is not correct at all. It's not that epic, but even though it just takes place in like the same couple days and same like fucking perimeter, it's really interesting, and it introduces new characters throughout that are like interesting, well developed, fun to read. They have like interesting backstories and shit, and it's very, very cool, and you're not bored throughout it. You're very invested in what goes on. Stephen King again has this very like cozy vernacular, and this is definitely a cozy read. Like, you can read this just like, you know, before bed each night. That's how I read it, just like an hour or so before bed, plot me off to dreamland. Very relaxing, weirdly enough. It's very relaxing to read like a nice little fantasy story like this before you go to sleep. But yeah, The Eyes of the Dragon is not necessarily like a great Stephen King book. It's mid-tier. If Insomnia is like lower tier, I would definitely say Insomnia is lower tier. The Outsider is actually higher tier. I actually read The Outsider and I really, really liked it. And I think it's a shame that more people kind of dismiss all of Stephen King's recent stuff as bad, because The Outsider was actually really, really fucking good. I'd put probably The Outsider and Eyes of the Dragon in the same kind of mid-tier, and then It and like Christine and like that and like the really upper echelon. But this is a damn good book. This is an underrated King classic here, and I think it doesn't get its fair recognition. I think it's kind of given an unfair treatment just because it's him trying to do something a little different. But he can write in this style really convincingly. And after reading this, I wish he had done more of this instead of like the kind of shift to crappy like crime stuff in the 2000s that he made, like Mr. Mercedes and Joyland and stuff. Because that stuff's like boring. This is where it's at. Like fantasy, he's actually good at as like a secondary genre besides horror. He's actually pretty good at this. I really like it. I really liked Eyes of the Dragon. All the characters are pretty cool. They're very well developed and interesting and three-dimensional. And he even avoids like very common tropes. And like I said, it doesn't feel like any other fairy tale. It feels like a very, very original story, which is what fantasy should aspire to do, even if it is borrowing from like old mythic tropes and ideas and themes from European mythology and like Anglo folklore. It should also feel like new and like you're reading something that hasn't been done a million times. So this is a much more unique work of fantasy, I would say, even than like Game of Thrones. and it's very, very different. And some people might like it for that, and some people might hate it, but I happen to really, really resonate with it, and I would recommend it. So yeah, The Eyes of the Dragon does get my stamp of approval. Better than Insomnia, and it actually makes me want to read The Dark Tower now. Stephen King has convinced me. I might actually start reading The Dark Tower. So all that said, what do I give The Eyes of the Dragon? I give The Eyes of the Dragon a nice little 9 out of 10. It is a pretty solid entry into the Stephen King multiverse. It's a lot of fun. It's very interesting. The characters are great. I just have to detract a couple points because, again, it feels kind of drawn out points, and I'm not sure if, like, anyone younger would actually want to read this. And again, like, someone older probably wouldn't enjoy, like, how namby-pamby and, like, kind of puerile it is. So it falls into a very weird range. I do have to kind of subtract at least a point for just kind of the more juvenile aspects of it, but that's just kind of Stephen King being Stephen King, and he can't always work those in a way that, like, makes sense or is particularly coherent. You know, just chalk it up to that, you know, he's got a feverish mind. He's got a weird fucking mind on his shoulders, but that's one of the things, you know, I like about him. That's ultimately one of his strengths. That's one of the reasons I consider him one of the greatest writers of all time. And yeah, I would deduct a point just because, like I said, it does feel a little drawn out at points. At least he doesn't, like, fucking try and rush it. I do feel like this would be very bad if it was rushed, but it's a decent read, a nice little tome to pore over and consider, and a fun oddity. This is a very unique book. It's very different, both from Stephen King's other books, from other fantasy books. It's a really unique experience and a really unique experiment, and I'm glad that Stephen King made this. I'm glad he had enough faith in it to publish it, and it was ultimately the right call. And yeah, just a very cool book. It's very inspiring. I would recommend it for fans of the fantasy genre. Again, I don't read too much fantasy, but it's something different, and you might like it. You might go, wow, you know, Stephen King actually has the chops. He actually tried it, and it went pretty fucking well, all things considered. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Eyes of the Dragon. It's a fun read, and I like it. Okay, I guess this review has been drawn out long enough, much like the book itself, so I'm gonna say that's it for this book review. Eyes of the Dragon, give it a read, good stuff. Catch you on the reading side. Remember to read. If you don't read, you just become an idiot.